Hi, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to class 2 of Reset and Refresh, BeetU's offering during this time of crisis, if you will, or this reset for humanity. I want to thank everybody. I'm Ashley Swartz, the faculty of Beet University. I'm Dean of the faculty. And I want to thank Katie and Andy and Jim and the whole crew that's helped us get here. I'm also the CEO of Furious Corp. The shared goal of Beet and of Furious and sort of us as human beings is really just to continue to be lighthouses during this period of unknown duration when we are all sort of forced to stay inside. And we have this amazing opportunity that the world has stopped. And we have this, unprecedented period of time where we can better ourselves. And we want everybody that's dislocated, working from home, if you've invested a lot of time and energy in homeschooling your children and your family, maybe it's time for you. And most importantly, we want to make sure that we're serving the young newcomers to our industry and giving them an opportunity to make sure that this time is not one in which they're lost. We'll be doing this every week on Wednesday throughout the semester, which is of unknown duration at 1 p.m. live. And then obviously the video will be available to continue to play afterwards. So whether you're a newcomer, you're a Titan, whatever, join us. It's fun, I promise. Most recently, Furious, over the last couple months, has started to produce some what we call TV 101 content, which is basic fundamentals about television and video. And one of the things we produced was a dictionary. And the URL that's on your screen right now is where you can find the interactive dictionary, or you can download it. And this is really going to be our syllabus. The dictionary itself has 12 different parts, and each with a thematic. And what we've done is we've taken those parts and we've sort of chunked them into what are really interesting, we hope, classes that we'll be sort of providing on a weekly basis. This is our second class, right? So the dictionary is a handy guide to have or make available. You can bookmark the interactive version of it on your desktop for work, and when you go back to an office and you're having water cooler conversation and someone drops a 3-letter acronym, you have a handy dandy guide. So we're hopeful it's useful, and we're going to use that to guide us. So we recommend you grab it and use it. Last week we started in our first class with an old school throwback to broadcast television and cable. And we just kind of went back to like where it all started in the origin, right? With the genesis of this industry and where we are. The second class, we're going to focus on sort of what are 4 sections within the dictionary, and then a 5th one we've added, which we think is important. And that is really looking at kind of where television is at a moment of time, right? It's painting that picture. So we're going to talk about commercial models for TV and video. We're then going to talk about how we watch television today. So the rise of digital video and what that is and what it means, the different manifestations of it. We're going to talk about video advertising products, data-driven television products. And then ultimately, we're going to talk a little bit about this thing called ad load and what that means. I think what's really important is that this is all about advertising, right? So we're talking about media, but ultimately we're talking about the construct of how advertising is a key commercial monetization tool for sellers of media. And I just want to be sure to sort of reframe that. And when we deliver the education and the definitions, it's really with that aperture slant. So let's get started. So let's just start with the distribution and commercial models around television and video. So, 10 years ago, if you wanted to watch TV, well, TV, first of all, only meant one thing. It was this screen in the living room, and you leaned back, right? You would call your cable or satellite provider. They would come to your house. They would deliver the final mile right to your house. You would get a piece of hardware called a set-top box, and you would put it in on your television, and you paid a large amount per month for a bunch of stuff you probably didn't watch, but it was worth it because you got the stuff you wanted to watch, right? So now the options have proliferated, and the estimate by the Video Advertising Bureau last year is that 71% of internet users use an over-the-top service or some type of digital-only, internet-enabled only, doesn't require a set-top box or any hardware to be delivered to your house on a monthly basis. So let's just go back and let's go sort of look through the sort of the shades of gray of distribution models, right? There's broadcasters and networks, right? So these are the traditional guys. They're creating programming. They're actually funding the programming, and they're supplying the content, and they are delivering, certain content mostly through sort of television station groups, right? So local stations via centralized operation. We talked about this last week. If you want to go deeper here, I suggest you go back to look at the first class we offered. An MVPD, or a mobile multi-channel video programming distributor, is really about the traditional way. That's the call you made 10 years ago, right? So that could be satellite, cable, it could be delivered over various technologies. But these guys really ultimately are the parties that are being squeezed the most in this transition to watching digital video over the internet in a, premium video content, which is just like television, without actually having to have a piece of hardware in your household or pay a monthly subscription. These guys include Comcast, Cox, DirecTV, Dish, etc. There's this sort of collective now called OTT, or over-the-top video services, right? So this is really streaming media that's offered direct to consumer, right? Quite often via the internet. And so this is really important because over the top is very literal. It's literally over the top of a set-top box. It's not a metaphor, it's very literal. We have a couple different flavors of that. So one is AVOD, that's advertising video on demand. So that's ad supported, right? They're not expecting a monthly subscription. There's no bill. There's no sort of fees. That's really through ads. And most of the content that's watched on YouTube is a great example of that. The second one is known as SVOD. And this is Netflix, and they were sort of the first and the biggest. Now Prime Video, HBO Go, and so SVOD is mostly, quite often, direct to consumer, right? So that is really it's Disney Plus just offered a new product, direct to consumer, etc. These guys pay a monthly subscription for unlimited access to content. What's really important is SVOD can sort of come in two different flavors, right? There's SVOD, which is authenticated, which means you can watch NBC's app because you have a Comcast or Optimum cable subscription, right? And then there's over-the-top SVOD that is direct with Peacock, which launched today. Congratulations to our friends at NBC, Denise, Linda, Krishan. Congrats. That launched today, that is actually direct to consumer, where the programmer or the media company themselves has a direct relationship, a billing relationship to the consumer. Then there's transactional video on demand. This is sort of not a really popular flavor. iTunes and Apple in particular, Apple TV tried this akin sort of to iTunes, because this is really what radically changed and disrupted the music industry. You have some sort of other models like that. But even Apple is switching more to sort of Apple TV Plus, right? It's really being trumped by subscription-based models, because people really don't want to buy premium video content a la carte, particularly episodic. And you have this category called virtual MVPDs, right? So these are virtual multi-channel video program distributors. You have some of the traditional MVPDs, like Dish, for example, that have created products like Sling that don't require hardware and don't require a set-top box, but really give you a traditional linear television experience, the scheduled programming, traditional ad formats, etc. But it's somehow a feed, a terrestrial feed, often is encoded and then delivered over internet protocol or IP to the household via an app or a browser, etc. And then you have those that don't actually have traditional cable or satellite operations, and they are not MVPDs in a purest sense. They are just new entrants and virtual only, like PlayStation and even YouTube Live, right? And now sort of what Apple would like to become in some ways, but is struggling a bit. In order to talk about television, you have to talk about how money is made in television. That's a big part of it, right? So the commercial models, particularly for television advertising, are changing radically. And particularly now they're changing radically. And we'll get a little bit into why even more so, right? The thing is that what sits behind all of this that we just need to get out there is that there is some type of elasticity curve. And I think it's fluid. I think that elasticity curve is dynamic. And I think it changes based on the platform, the size of the screen, the device, the time of day, the content. And in regards to how much ad time, the ratio of ad time viewed versus content actually consumed and viewed, there's an elasticity curve there, that value exchange between audiences and programmers, right? And I think that's really important. And I don't know that anybody has cracked the nut or figured out the secret formula to actually what is optimal, and it's changing, and there's a lot of experimentation. So when we talk about television advertising, one of the things that, given that it's just ever increasingly more challenging to sell television and to productize it, we have sort of this evolution of different platforms and technologies that are enabling it. So one of them is this thing called programmatic TV. And I'm talking right now just about the selling of advertising and the value, right? So what happens is when you fish with a net and you buy television, which is all about reach and frequency, and typically a Nielsen guaranteed, you're buying a spot, you have reach, right? You're fishing with a net. But then when you want to buy my shtick, everybody's heard of this, yogurt eating moms in Duluth in the market for a minivan, you go from an approachable audience of 7 figures to like 97 women that live in Duluth that want to buy a minivan. And so, what is advertising is that meaningful if you're, or particularly investing in creating video creative for the purpose of reaching such a small audience. So one of the things that needs to happen as data is used more and more to target consumers or viewers, and brands and advertisers and agencies know more and more about who they want to target, and they're managing their funnel downstream to get closer to purchase or conversion, we have to start to aggregate video content more. And the reason I talked about the elasticity curve is because it also applies to the fact that premium digital video is illiquid. It's supply constrained. There is not as much premium digital video content around what is premium television-like video, over the top or delivered over the internet, as there is traditional television ad space, right? So that's also sort of a curve of value and cost that we need to consider. And so what we've seen is there are value-added resellers, or sort of folks in the middle, that have entered the market to try and make this limited, sort of inventory more valuable or more meaningful for buyers in particular, and then increase revenue to sellers. And they are called programmatic marketplaces. And they're different for display than they are for video. And that's very, very important. It's because of the supply constrained nature of video. So programmatic is really an automated way of buying, but it's most importantly about aggregating inventory from multiple sellers and being able to buy an audience instead of an adjacency to a specific piece of content. So we have supply side platforms, which actually help sellers sell their inventory and put their inventory alongside other sellers' inventory within a marketplace, right? So audiences can be sold. And then ultimately, major SSPs, for example, include PubMatic, AppNexus, Rubicon, et cetera. And then we have demand side platforms, right? So supply side is the pipe in. We have demand side platforms that allow buyers to actually use their first party data often to go in and buy audiences that meet their criteria, and to target using their first party data blind match with third party data to be able to actually target, which also is the meaning of addressable, or to address an audience, even though it's sort of pure digital video. One of the challenges of programmatic, and particularly sort of this idea of making traditional television inventory more programmatic and creating traditional linear television marketplaces for traditional TV advertising versus pure digital video, is formats. Is that typically we see, and we're going to get into this with ad loads a little bit, that formats is actually a challenge or a hurdle for a lot of these programmatic marketplaces for video, because not all ad servers or not all marketplaces support the entire spectrum of ad formats or video ad formats. And we're going to come back around to that. That's why I sort of seeded that right now, so you hold on to that. Before we get into ad formats, I want to talk about how we watch television, right? So let's just talk about our experience as audiences. So in the past decade, what it means has radically changed. Watching TV used to be walking into your living room, picking up the remote, leaning back, and just letting it happen, right? Then maybe it was a little bit more lean in, where you were recording something and time TiVo, and then you were fast skipping ads or whatever. But really, it was about being in your living room and sort of something that was scheduled. And you had to at least be cognizant of when it was scheduled. Now, you can really watch Game of Thrones whatever you want. You may want to watch it so that, there's no spoiling on Twitter or anywhere else, or Instagram, in the time between you get the chance to watch it and it actually airs. But ultimately, it's on demand when you want, wherever you want it. This concept of connected television is really, again, a catch-all. It's about video content that's accessed via a streaming internet connection, right? So it can be via apps or other over-the-top hardware devices like Apple TV, et cetera, mobile. These things you can either buy in stores or integrate it into your smart television, which has an operating system. And then there's this idea of linear, right? So this is how traditional TV was traditionally scheduled. And a lot of it is still actually watched that way, and increasingly more during this period of reset that we're in, right? So we talked a lot about that last week, so I'm not going to unpack that much more. This concept of OTT, or over the top, is really this paradigm of people accessing streaming video content without having a set-top box. It's really that simple, right? Content is sent over, it's encoded, it's compressed, and it's sent over the internet so that you have a linear-like television experience on an internet-enabled device. That's straightforward. Video on demand is really about people watching video content whenever they want, right? So those flavors, going back to the last section, that is SVOD, that's AVOD, et cetera. So Netflix qualifies as that, Prime Video. It's basically when you want it, however you want it. This has created, as a result, all of this sort of increasing complexity. This has created a much sort of larger menu and a broader menu of ad products for video, both within traditional television as well as then ultimately for video holistically. So, while the lion's share of spend, and then it decreases every year as a percentage, continues to be traditional television that's packaged and sold in a traditional way, reach, frequency, spot guarantees using Nielsen. We see a proliferation of new ad formats that aren't 30s, 60s, or 15s, right? Particularly because a 30-second ad or even a 15 can seem really long on a mobile device or a small screen. So we see new formats of video ads, right? 6s, 7 seconds, 10 seconds. We see it proliferating and having a variety of formats. That was the reference I made earlier about one of the constraints of some of these marketplaces and these sort of programmatic solutions is they don't necessarily support all the formats that perhaps advertisers want to buy or sellers can sell to maximize yield. So, it was interesting. In 2017, Fox actually was the first linear broadcaster to offer 7-second ads during the NFL. And they've been one of the most sort of progressive, experimental, traditional television sellers in this introduction of new ad formats. But still, based on what we see in historical sales transactional data coming off of television trafficking systems, it's really 15s and 30s and some 60s. The 8 position is something that is talked about, slightly less, but is still important. It's really the first position in a commercial break. So, and that applies to in television, when you're watching it, it's the first one you see that rolls once we break to commercial. So you're going to see it before you go to refill your beverage, or actually if you have if you have a mid-roll, for example, or you're watching something online or you're watching it over the top, it's typically that first ad unit, which is more valuable from a price perspective. An interstitial is something that happens during a natural break in experience, right? So full screen ads in mobile are really the most common form of interstitials, particularly in like games, right? So when you're going from level to level, when there's kind of a natural transition or a break in the experience or the programming, it's a great time to put an experience in there to sort of, to transition while actually getting an exposure and taking advantage of that opportunity. A pod is a group of ads. So, the sort of 2 minutes that you have, kind of in between as television programming in a traditional linear sense is chunked, we call that a pod, right? It's a group of ads that airs during a commercial break. Pre-roll, post-roll, and mid-roll are very sort of traditional IAB ad terms that refer to video inventory that runs before a video is played, can be interrupted during a certain amount of time into that video, and the video is actually stopped, and then ultimately post, which is ever increasingly less common or non-existent after a video is run because people just don't hang out to watch them. They are typically shorter formats, 10, 15 seconds, 12 seconds, 6, 7, etc. Again, another reason that, this proliferation of ad formats has made selling premium digital video more complex than maybe it necessarily needs to be. So the upfront versus scatter, this construct is really, it's a commercial model. It's not a product, but it's actually how premium television inventory and video is sold. So typically, as long as we can sort of remember, in May of every year, we have this cattle call called the upfronts, right? And this is where traditional television broadcasters and cable nets go to market. And now this includes MVPDs and sort of SVOD and AVOD distributors like Hulu, YouTube, et cetera, that come to market and actually present their inventory. And they're looking to get commitments from large advertisers mostly that are willing to commit minimum spends and lock in pricing for what is the most highly valued sort of real estate or units, right? And then that typically sometimes can move 70, 80% of their revenue. And then the rest of it is sold on a month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter basis in this sort of cycle called scatter. So the upfronts have been canceled this year in May because of COVID. And that means that most of the inventory in 2021 for television, the largest television ad sales P&Ls, like the $10 billion at NBC, et cetera, they are going to be sold on a scatter basis. So that means that the sales operational workflow and process is just going to be a lot more difficult, a lot more work. And, you have to eat what you kill. It's going to be a lot harder, to be honest, because advertisers they're going to want to see more ROI from every dollar they spend. And the fact that that is now sold in a scatter market is going to make things challenging and different. But there's going to be opportunity there as well for all of us to get better. So So let's talk about data-driven TV products. So this is something we talk a lot about, and most of the Beat events have been really focused on this in the last couple, years in particular. And this is really sort of where television and digital advertising converge, right? So the promise of one-to-one targeting at scale for television has been talked about for a long time, right? Throwbacks to things like Canoe and Black Arrow and all that stuff's been around for a long time, right? So the reality is that this requires, again, investment in hardware and the hardware isn't in place, right? The estimate right now is that addressable TV spend is projected to be about $3.37 billion in 2020 for eMarketer. Now that number came out prior to this reset, so I don't know what the impact is going to be, but the point is that it's growing, right? So we use this phrase advanced advertising collectively, and we typically mean it. We often talk about it in the context of video advertising and television, right? And it's really this umbrella term referring to the innovations of TV delivery models that are resulting in new ad products and ad innovation, right? Beyond just linear. So that's addressable, that's OTT, it's this catch-all. When we say advanced for linear television, that means something very specific. We're talking about the packaging of television inventory to target an audience in a probabilistic way. So it's typically using an index. And you're suggesting, and you've done, a seller has done research on their own, and they've sort of created these audience segments that they know that this bundle of either networks and or programs or a combination is higher likely than whatever 1.2, 1.3 indexes higher than the mean of their programming to reach a certain audience. So it's probabilistic again. It's not household level targeting or device level targeting, right? That's very important. And it means the first party data can't be used with which to target an ad and blind matched. Addressable is that true targeted, sort of set device or household level delivery, right? It's the ability to deliver to specific households. And the estimate is, I think this year from the BAB, that we have currently about 64 million addressable households in the US that actually have the technology and the hardware and set-top boxes in place to allow for addressable targeted ads. Linear insertion specifically is a phrase that we use when we talk about the operators that are enabling or have enabled addressable advertising within their subscriber footprint, right? So they've deployed hardware, they have set-top boxes in market with increasingly, more advanced internet protocol or IP-enabled technologies, both one-way and two-way, to receive IP as well as to push back IP, which is part of the arc of maturation or innovation of these devices. Linear insertion is really about, ultimately it's for targeting. It's so that our advertisers can utilize their first and third party data to blind match it and target a specific subscriber, right? Using PII or personally identifiable information, all within privacy practices and standards, using a third party to do the matching, et cetera, and reach those relevant households, right? So this is actually really important because this is where TV becomes like digital. But again, we have this issue of fishing with a net versus fishing with a line. So 64 million households, how many of those 64 million households are yogurt eating moms in the market for a minivan that have households above $100,000 income? Because that's how digital advertising is typically bought. So you can see where we're sort of still in this transition phase of really approaching, hopefully sooner than later, what is a scalable market, but we are still in this sort of nascent stage, if you will, just given the lack of installed footprint that have addressable set-top boxes in their homes. Dynamic insertion is a construct. When we talk about television, we typically mean that is the ability within a video on demand experience, typically on a set-top box or anywhere else, where we can actually switch out an ad and we can, change it over time. We can actually change that ad placement. So when we talk about it from the perspective of traditional cable and on a set-top box, if you're watching some video on demand, it means that although you're still watching it on the set-top box and it's provided by your cable or satellite operator, it's a different ad that you would see in a specific pod and the number of that pod on Tuesday, 2 weeks after it first ran versus the first run. Right? And then dynamic insertion is just the construct. That's old hat for digital. That's what we do. That's what all the ad tech is. It dynamically inserts ad based on a set of rules. Well, on set-top boxes, and particularly for video on demand on set-top boxes, it's not as easy as that. And it does require also a certain type of technology within that hardware itself. So I want to end with this idea of ad load because it's something that we talk about, but it really does impact the economics. And again, there's this elasticity curve I was talking about. These are all really just sort of big, large, macro economic sort of things that we need to figure out, and dynamics within the industry that will change because things like being quarantined at home change audience viewing behaviors. And when we're all of a sudden free and able to run wild again, with masks, we will have a different perception of how many ads we're willing to see for a sort of duration of time of content viewed and consumed, right? So the definition varies from TV to digital for ad load. When we talk about it for linear television, we're typically talking about the number of ads per pod, and then ultimately the number of pods, per hour, right? So which equates to a number of ads per hour per time of viewing. A typical pod is 2 minutes, I just discussed before, right? For digital, it sort of depends on the format, right? So, you can have an ad load that is X number of ads per, whatever amount of time of video consumed. But there's a big difference between a 6-second video ad versus a 25-second or 20-second video ad rather, right? So a lot of it has to do with the format. And because digital video advertising has so many more formats, that ratio is much more fluid and dynamic. And it's much less prescribed and sort of formulaic than it is for linear television. So ultimately, we also have this thing called rich media, which we can't forget, that still looks like, feels like, smells like is video advertising to the average consumer. These are rich media. So these are traditional IAB formats, right? They could be a 300 by 250 on the side rail, or they can be in content like some of the really cool New York Times, custom formats, or companies like Teads that put it in written content as you scroll down a page where video is inserted, it expands. There's so many neat things that can be done right now. And these are traditional Internet Advertising Bureau standard ad units. Some not, but most are traditional IAB standard units that can be served through any, ad server. And ultimately, they're still video. So I think it's, apples to oranges, but it still is video when you're sitting back and you're watching video content. And we can't forget that or be remiss to consider it when we talk about ad load, right? So a long time ago, I think this is also a lovely throwback statistic that is important. It was until about 1982 that the television industry, which were just programmers and broadcasters, and obviously there were, sort of cable operators there too, but they had this idea of a TV code, right? So this television code limited, and everybody agreed, to 9.5 minutes per hour of television advertising. In 1982, the Justice Department said, that's collusion, and actually that is disadvantaging and potentially price gouging buyers because we are limiting and controlling the amount of supply. So the macroeconomics is you constrain supply and price artificially increases, right? So great idea, strong macroeconomic principles, but that didn't go over so well because ultimately what ended up happening as that was sort of as the television sort of ad load per hour was freed or liberalized, what we ended up seeing were all these new formats. So we had infomercials, right? We had cable networks at the same time popping up. And so all of a sudden we had this barrage and this flood of inventory for traditional television ad units that was lowering prices overall. And so the broadcast networks were then lowering their price because there was such a surplus of inventory available of traditional linear TV spots. And then you had audience behavior and the arc of change that started to occur in sort of the 80s and 90s with VHS and the ability to record program and fast forward through ads. And then you had TiVo when you could do it with your set-top box. And now we have SVOD. So ultimately, this idea of a controlling ad load by a governing body might be meaningful in some ways, or at least something to reconsider, to take a look at, right? Because what's happened is now the pendulum has swung back, and because it's a more competitive market, and now we're also competing with digital for buyers' dollars. The reality is that some folks have abused this and they have oversaturated, and the ad load is just incredibly high, and there's the signal to noise ratio is very, very low. It's very hard to hear the signal or make ads that that resonate and have confidence they will when there are so many of them, right? So ultimately, we do see some leadership and we see titans of the industry and leaders like Linda Yaccarino and NBC that have been taking stances, and they've been laying down the gauntlet by saying, we are not going to increase ad load. In fact, we're going to reduce it. And that's how they are providing signal in the noise of what is a very complicated television market right now. So if you wait long enough, it always comes back around, right? So there was an article based on research from UBS, the bank, and I think their equity research or their EMT group that MediaPost published a few years ago about like the chart showing 11 to 15 minutes per hour now is the average, right, in 2018 for non-program promotional ads. That's incredible. And the New York Times subsequently, a few months later, an article just said, like, the problem with advertising is that people hate ads. And so we need to be really conscious of this as video time, time-consuming video is the highest it's ever been, and it will at least stay level, if not continue to increase during this period. We really need to be conscientious of the experience and making sure we don't compromise it. So digital TV research said global revenue from AVOD distribution will nearly triple from $22 billion in 2018 to $56 billion in 2024. So the question is, with all these new ads and all, this sort of rising of the sea, is everybody going to be able to stay buoyant? Are advertisers going to be able to remain buoyant, right? And the big question is that ultimately, with all this increasing complexity and the noise that we just talked about in the system, how the hell does an advertiser have confidence that a consumer is going to hear the signal when they see their ad? How do we make their media matter and make every dollar they spend deliver them measurable ROI so they keep spending, particularly now during this reset and when we've lost some of the most valuable inventory because sports has been discontinued? So a lot of great questions. And it's my pleasure to get to spend my days trying to tackle them and really doing my best to help my clients find answers. So, and a lot of those answers lie in the data. Just saying. So thank you for attending class 2. Next week in class 3, we'll be just getting in the weeds and bringing sexy back with details of ad targeting, the ad tech stack, currencies of measurement, and then digital standards. Woo! It's going to be exciting. So I invite you to come back, give feedback, suggestions, tell me what you want to talk about. This is a pleasure for me. And so I'm thankful that you've given me your time. And that's it. Light to all, love to all, peace to all. Thank you.